last session that we had, we talked about the processes in the kidney through which urine is made. Now all of that is part of the osmoregulation mammals. So we have initially talked about ultrafiltration, and this happens at the Malpighian body, which is the glomerulus and the Bowman's capsule combined, and the majority of the contents are filtered through, and the filtrate is just about the same. The components and the concentration of the filtrate and the blood is about the same. Right, the only thing missing from the filtrate are proteins and blood cells, and that's because they're too large to pass through the capillary wall. What's helping the filtration is the pressure of blood in the glomerulus, because it's very high. It's coming in from an artery to an arteriole and then the capillary, so the pressure is higher because the lumen size is getting smaller. What's at work over here is diffusion, osmosis, and concentration gradients are coming into effect, and the cells of the Bowman's capsule act as an additional filter. Then you've got selective reabsorption happening, where water, glucose, and salts are reabsorbed into the blood. It starts off with the proximal tubule, where about 80% of the filtrate is reabsorbed. And the cells of the tubule have microvilli, which increase the surface area of absorption. They have a lot of mitochondria, which means it is an active process, and it is utilizing ATP. All the glucose, amino acids, vitamins, most hormones, 85% of the sodium, chloride, and water is reabsorbed. And from the proximal tubule, it goes into the tissue fluid and then into the blood. So the concentration increases in the tissue fluid, and from there diffuses into the blood, and the blood is constantly flowing, which helps maintain the diffusion rate. Then we come to the loop of Henle, where the filtrate is isotonic with the tissue fluid. The water potential is the same on both ends, and so what happens over here is what's called a counter current multiplier. A concentration gradient is developed. So it doesn't exist. It is the gradient over here. Concentration gradient is developed, and how is that happening? So sodium ions are actively transported from the filtrate into the tissue fluid, increasing the solute concentration or the osmotic concentration of the tissue fluid, and water follows by osmosis. The descending limb of the loop of Henle is permeable to water. The ascending limb is not permeable to water but to sodium ions, and so the sodium ions are actually being removed from keep forgetting the highlighter. So the sodium ions are actually being removed from the ascending limb, so that's a limb that's going back up. And because of that, water is being removed from the descending limb. Calcium ions follow sodium ions due to both due to a concentration gradient and a gradient of charge, which is called an electrochemical gradient. And finally, I believe the last thing we talked about is the reabsorption, the distal tubule, and the collecting duct. The distal tubule is permeable to water, but that permeability depends on ADH and the collecting duct as well. It is strongly affected by ADH, and water is reabsorbed from both of these. The final bit of water that needs the fine tuning of the water reabsorption that needs to happens at the distal tubule and the collecting duct. And both of these are under the effect of ADH, which is the antidiuretic hormone. And then the final filtrate moves down to the ureter from the collecting duct, and then goes into the bladder as urine, which is usually hypertonic. It's very concentrated. There's very little water as compared to the solutes. The urine is stored in the bladder, and then when there's enough of it, it is passed out of the body via the urethra. And right, so that is the process. Now, speaking of ADH, that is what we're going to talk about today. So, chapter 7C3 of the student book 2 for Edexcel. And the topic is control of the kidney and homeostasis, but basically I'm going to talk about osmoregulation by the anti-diuretic hormone, right? ADH. So, as we just mentioned, right, the ADH is its primary targets are the distal tubule and the collecting duct for the final bit of reabsorption for water and accompanying salts. In fact, it is the salts that help in the reabsorption of water. So,
Sorry, your voice is lagging.
my sorry,
Yes, your voice was lagging.
is it all right now, or is it still lagging? Right. So, as I was saying, the right what eight so ADH is, as we talked about earlier on when we were discussing homeostasis and the role of the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus. ADH is produced by the hypothalamus and it is stored in the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland, and when required, it is released by the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. So ADH produced.
Sorry, can you share your screen?
Oh, sorry. Okay. Produced by hypothalamus and stored and released. Stored in and released from the posterior pituitary gland. You can call it the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland, or you can just call it the posterior pituitary gland. Alright, so it is released into the blood, obviously. It's a hormone, so the right endocrine system and right it increases the permeability of water to the distal tubule and the collecting duct. How does it work? Well, it's right one of the hormones that binds to receptors on the cell surface membrane. So it's not entering the cell; it binds to the receptor on the cell surface membrane of either the distal tubule or the collecting duct, and from there it triggers right the signaling cascade, which results in the formation of the secondary messenger, which is cyclic AMP. And then the cyclic AMP goes on and takes part in another series of reactions. And what that does is it causes the movement of vesicles containing water channels fuse with the right cell membranes of the tubules and increase the permeability. Now, it's not given in the book, but those water channels, those proteins are called aquaporins. Right? Aqua meaning water, porins meaning pores, so they're basically the channels or the holes. You're creating holes in the cells to allow water to move in. These are stored in vesicles. So under the effect of ADH, the vesicles through the signaling cascade are signaled to move towards the cell membrane that is lining, right, the part where the filtrate is, right, not the part where the blood vessels are. So, right, this is a blood vessel apparently, and right, this is the part we're going to have aquaporins. This is the tubule, and right on the inside where it's facing the lumen of the tubule, which has the filtrate, you're going to have these water channels come up, right, obviously from the vesicles in the cells, and going to insert into cell surface membrane and then increase permeability. Okay, and from there, right, water moves through the tubules into the surrounding blood capillaries. Blood capillaries via osmosis, obviously. Right. Now, obviously, ADH controls how much water needs to be reabsorbed from the tubule, the distal tubule, and the collecting duct. And so, amount of ADH regulates, right, amount of water channels that are utilized, right, which all obviously boils down to the amount of water reabsorbed. Now, right, if the water potential of the blood is sufficient or if it's high, then what would happen is in case of, let's say, high, right, blood osmotic, right, uh, water potential. That means you've got more water than you want. And so how that's regulated is it's detected by the hypothalamus, right? It's detected by sensors in the brain, receptors or sensors. which is the hypothalamus. And so, right, what they decrease the secretion of ADH. There's no other hormone that's being secreted. It's regulated by ADH. So increasing secretion of ADH increases reabsorption. Decreasing secretion of ADH would mean, right, that all the subsequent steps, you don't have cyclic AMP, right? You don't have, so the water channels are actually taken back up. So instead of saying there are less water channels, right, the water channels, the aquaporins are taken back up into vesicles, in the tubule cells. And obviously that means water, right? Less water is reabsorbed. And that would mean a greater volume of urine is produced. Right, the term for these are osmoreceptors. So they're in the hypothalamus. Right. So obviously it depends on your body's water requirement. If you're losing a lot of water due to heat and sweating or something else, then more water needs to be conserved in the body, and so more water will be reabsorbed. Concentrated urine, maybe it won't be formed as frequently, and so, right, something we've probably experienced. If you've drunk a large volume of water in one go, so that's absorbed through the intestine, and so there's more water than we need, and so, right, the opposite, ADH secretion is goes down, and, right, more urine is produced, more water is removed from the body. All right, there's something else happening, and that is, right, what also affects the formation of urine and the retention or the removal of water from the body is the regulation of blood pressure. So I'll just go to the next page, I guess. And since I'm here, I guess it works. Okay, so pressure and osmoregulation. So, right, blood pressure, a very big part of it is like blood is basically water. So if higher blood pressures are detected or the blood pressure rises, that often is a sign of increase in blood volume. So right, and so for that, uh, right, the secretion of ADH or the release of ADH will be suppressed, and that would lead to the production of a greater volume of urine. Right, water is lost, and so that would, right, bring the blood volume down and thereby bringing the blood pressure down. Right, and that is why medicines that are taken for the control of high blood pressure are called diuretics. Right, and I mentioned earlier on diuresis basically means dilute urine. So diuretics are the medicines that are causing the production of dilute urine. Now, if the blood pressure falls, obviously, that means a decrease in blood volume, and that would, right, mean release of ADH and less urine produced. Right, more water is retained, right, and return to the blood. And so all of this, right, is part, this is happening in your body all the time. Hopefully not the blood pressure part, right, it remains more or less constant unless maybe you're suffering from weakness or a lot of exertion or stress, maybe, hopefully not. And so all of this is part of a normal dynamic equilibrium, right, in mammalian systems. And obviously homeostasis. Any questions?
No, sir.
All right, so we're not done with homeostasis yet. There is the next chapter. Would you like to continue?
Sure, sir.
Just decrease the size just a bit. So you've got seven C4 thermoregulation. So how the body maintains the internal core temperature, right? And obviously it's a part of homeostasis. And just on a side note, right, this topic is not in the Cambridge syllabus, right? So it's in the Edexcel syllabus. We're talking about maintaining core body temperature, right? And it's basically happening in mammals. Well, mammals are, warm-blooded. So you're not going to have this happening in fish or lizards like crocs and all of that, or insects, right? But you're going to have this happening in your own body, or the stray cat that you see walking down the street, or the bird that flew by. Now, where do, right, how do organisms warm up or cool down? So, right, keep in mind they're talking about the core temperature, so it's going to be different probably from the surrounding temperature, but the surrounding temperature does have an effect. Why does it have an effect? Because we can either gain or lose heat via, right, conduction, convection, and radiation, right, between the body and environment. So they've given a number of points in the book. I'll just list them over here. So, right, organisms warm up as a byproduct of metabolism. Right, so all the chemical reactions that are occurring in your body, we call it, loss of energy as heat, but you can call it loss, but that heat is what helps us keep warm and what helps us, what actually provides the heat to our body from the things that we consume. So from the chemical breakdown of foods. The book mentions it as chemical inefficiency and energy that is wasted, but I would disagree with that. Anyway, okay, how do we cool down? So we cool down by evaporation of water from the body surface. Right? And so we've got sweating. So the way sweating helps cool us down is that sweat obviously contains water, and water has a high latent heat of vaporization, and so it takes heat from the body to evaporate and thereby cooling us. Right? That's the science behind it. Certain animals cool, from their mouth. So they keep their mouths open. For example, you've seen dogs panting, right? So they're actually trying to cool down in certain cases, losing water from their mouths. Then, right, you may transfer energy between the body and the environment via radiation. So, right, radiation is a transfer of energy in the form of electromagnetic waves. And in that, right, infrared radiation. So IR, infrared, is the the electromagnetic radiation via which heat can be gained or lost by animals. Then you've got, right, a transfer of energy between yourself and, right, your body and the environment via convection. And convection is the transfer of energy by currents of air or water. Right, and so they mentioned that convection currents are set up around relatively hot objects, so adaptations to prevent cooling by these currents are common. Right, so you've got convection happening, and then finally you've got conduction. And that is the transfer of heat by the collision of molecules. Right, so this happens when, for example, you are in contact with the ground or water, not so much the air because air does not conduct well. So air is not a good conductor of heat. And neither is fat. In fact, both of these are insulators. Right, and so the role of fats, not so much but air in insulating the body and reducing the loss of heat will be mentioned later on. I will have to stop here. There is a diagram in the chapter which further summarizes the warming and cooling aspect of the body. Uh, Tomorrow I'll get into it. It's not detailed. It won't take very long. So we'll finish this tomorrow and then move on to a new topic. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure, sir. No
Right.
problem.
There's well, there's not a lot happening, but still, right? I don't want to start that and then leave it halfway. So you get started with this tomorrow only and get done with it and
Sure.
then move on to a new topic. Any questions?
No, sir.
All right. Then I'll see you next class, inshallah.
Inshallah, sir. Allah Hafiz.